What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated? What if a single bullet never fired could have saved 16 million lives? What if World War I, the war to end all wars, never happened? Would our modern world look the same? Today, we're diving into one of history's greatest what-ifs. What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had never been assassinated? Buckle up, because we're about to unravel how one man's survival could have changed the course of the 20th century, and maybe your life today. Picture Europe in the early 20th century like a vast, beautifully decorated ballroom, filled with powerful nations locked in a tense, uneasy dance. Each step was measured, each move watched carefully by the others. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, had spent decades forming alliances, stockpiling weapons, and quietly preparing for a conflict they all feared, but none of them truly wanted. Yet, despite all the rivalry and mistrust, war wasn't inevitable. At least, not yet. Diplomacy, fragile though it was, still held the balance. The continent was divided into two main camps, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, on one side, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, on the other. These alliances were supposed to preserve peace through mutual protection. Ironically, they created a situation where a small conflict could spiral into a global war. If one domino fell, the others would follow. But what many forget is that peace had been preserved for decades despite these tensions. Crises had flared up in Morocco, the Balkans, and elsewhere, but they were diffused by diplomatic negotiations. War was a constant threat, but it hadn't yet arrived. And right at the center of this delicate equation stood Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Franz Ferdinand wasn't a fire-breathing nationalist or a militaristic hawk. He wasn't itching for battle. In fact, quite the opposite. He was a cautious reformer, deeply aware of the fractures within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You see, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a sprawling patchwork of ethnic groups: Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, and many others. Each group had its own culture, language, and, most importantly, its own political ambitions. Many of them dreamed of independence, or at least greater autonomy. Franz Ferdinand, unlike his predecessors, recognized that suppressing these ambitions through violence would only fuel unrest. His solution? Reform the empire into a more federal structure, granting greater self-rule to its many peoples. This vision, though controversial among the conservative elite in Vienna, could have saved the empire from collapse. Crucially, it might have reduced tensions with Serbia, a small but fiercely nationalistic neighbor. Serbia had long supported Slavic nationalism in the Balkans and harbored secret organizations like the Black Hand, the very group that would later orchestrate the Archduke's assassination. Franz Ferdinand understood Serbia's importance. He didn't want a war with them. He knew such a conflict could ignite the larger alliances into action. His survival could have meant that Austria-Hungary pursued a policy of cautious diplomacy rather than violent confrontation. But outside of Austria-Hungary, storm clouds were still gathering. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was flexing its muscles, seeking a larger role on the world stage. The Germans felt encircled by the Entente powers and had been building up their military, especially their navy, to challenge Britain's supremacy. Russia, meanwhile, saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and had its own ambitions in the Balkans. Any threat to Serbia would likely draw Russia into the fray. France, still bitter over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War decades earlier, was allied with Russia and ready to back them up. And Britain, though traditionally isolated from continental squabbles, was increasingly drawn into this tangled web to protect its interests and maintain the balance of power. The entire continent was on edge, but there was still room for leaders to step back from the brink. So, imagine an alternate timeline where Franz Ferdinand survives the assassination attempt in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Maybe his car takes a different route. Maybe his security detail is more prepared. Or maybe, in a twist of fate, the assassin Gavrilo Princip's gun jams or his aim fails. Franz Ferdinand returns safely to Vienna, shaken but alive. His near-death experience strengthens his resolve to pursue reform. He pushes harder for policies that grant autonomy to ethnic minorities, diffusing nationalist anger within the empire. Austria-Hungary, while still fragile, begins to modernize politically instead of resorting to repression. Most critically, Austria-Hungary avoids issuing the infamous July ultimatum to Serbia, a harsh set of demands that, in our timeline, made war almost certain. Instead of mobilizing troops, they opened diplomatic channels. Serbia, relieved not to be facing an ultimatum backed by Germany's might, tones down its rhetoric and agrees to cooperate on regional stability. With no assassination, there is no July crisis. Without the July crisis, the dominoes of mobilization don't fall. Germany doesn't feel compelled to support Austria-Hungary. Russia doesn't mobilize to protect Serbia. France doesn't ready its armies in response. And Britain, ever cautious, stays on the sidelines, watching from across the channel as peace, fragile, imperfect peace, holds a little longer. But even if Franz Ferdinand's reforms temporarily eased tensions in the Balkans, it's fair to ask, was Europe truly out of danger? Or was the powder keg still there, waiting for a different spark? Could a crisis in Morocco, the Middle East, or even within Germany itself have triggered a conflict later on? Was the drive for empire, glory, and dominance too powerful to contain indefinitely? For now, though, in this alternate 1914, Europe breathes easier. Millions of young men are not yet marching off to war. The trenches of the Western Front remain empty. Fields across France, Belgium, and Eastern Europe remain unscarred by artillery and blood. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire buys itself precious time to try and hold together its fracturing lands. But how long could this peace really last? What happens next in a Europe where Franz Ferdinand lives to shape policy? That's what we'll explore in Part 2, where we dive into the immediate effects of his survival and the surprising ways history might have unfolded without the Great War tearing everything apart. Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the second half of 1914. The air still thick with tension, but the streets of Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and London remain bustling with life, not overshadowed by the dark clouds of war. In this alternate reality, Franz Ferdinand's survival has bought Europe a critical window of peace. The assassination attempt in Sarajevo failed, and with it, the match that could have set the continent ablaze was never struck. Austria-Hungary, guided by Ferdinand's more moderate approach, chooses diplomacy over aggression. Rather than issuing Serbia an impossible ultimatum, Vienna opens diplomatic talks, seeking accountability for the nationalist conspiracies, but without threats of war. Germany, relieved to avoid a messy Balkan conflict, breathes easier. The German High Command, always ready to back its Austrian ally, now sees no immediate need for military intervention. In turn, Russia, often ready to support Serbia against Austrian aggression, keeps its armies demobilized. France, bound by alliance to Russia, sees no cause for alarm. And Britain, always hesitant to entangle itself in continental conflicts, stays focused on its empire and trade. Thus, 1914 passes without the Great War. The fragile peace of Europe, an uneasy balance of power and ambition, remains intact. Peaceful, but not peaceful. But don't be fooled. This peace isn't built on trust or goodwill. Beneath the surface, nationalist tensions, imperial ambitions, and military rivalries still churn. The Balkans remain a hotbed of instability, where ethnic groups long for independence and resent foreign rule. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, despite Ferdinand's reforms, is still fragile and divided. Serbia continues to dream of a greater Serbia. Meanwhile, Germany remains industrially powerful and militarily assertive, eager for global recognition. Russia eyes the Balkans and Eastern Europe as spheres of influence. France never forgets the humiliation of losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany decades earlier. Britain, the world's preeminent empire, grows increasingly wary of Germany's naval buildup and commercial competition. Yet, for the time being, diplomacy holds. Ambassadors exchange notes instead of nations exchanging gunfire. European leaders attend conferences rather than war councils. Military spending, while still significant, no longer escalates at the breakneck pace of the pre-war years. Some politicians even hope that the near crisis in Sarajevo serves as a wake-up call, prompting future reforms to make war less likely. A booming economy, a different 1920s. In the absence of war, Europe's industrial powers continue to thrive. Factories churn out automobiles, telephones, and household appliances rather than rifles and artillery shells. Railroads expand across the continent. Cities like Vienna, Berlin, and Paris hum with cultural energy and economic prosperity. Art, science, and literature flourish without the interruptions of mass mobilization. In our timeline, World War I brought unprecedented destruction and suffering, killing millions and devastating economies. But in this alternate history, the lost generation never loses its life to the trenches of France. Farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers live out their years in peace, raising families, building communities, and contributing to progress rather than perishing in battlefields. Technological advancements associated with the war, tanks, machine guns, chemical weapons, and aircraft used for combat, are either delayed or developed in different contexts. Without the pressure of total war, these deadly innovations may emerge later, or possibly never evolve into the devastating forms we know. Without the financial strain of war, Europe enters the 1920s in a very different position. Instead of being weakened by debt and destruction, nations invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The 1920s in Europe mirror the prosperity of America's roaring 20s, jazz clubs in Paris, bustling cafes in Vienna, and roaring factories in Berlin. Vienna, in particular, avoids the decline it faced after the war, retaining its place as a vibrant capital of culture and politics, colonial tensions, and imperial competitions. Yet while Europe enjoys this fragile prosperity, tensions smolder elsewhere. Colonial rivalries in Africa and Asia remain unresolved. France and Britain still compete for influence across the Middle East and North Africa. Germany, with its smaller colonial empire, continues to push for greater overseas territories. Without a war to distract them, these powers might focus their ambitions abroad, potentially leading to clashes in places like Morocco, Egypt, or Southeast Asia. Japan, rising as a regional power, still challenges Western influence in Asia. The United States, meanwhile, watches from across the Atlantic, maintaining its isolationist stance but keeping a close eye on trade opportunities and geopolitical shifts. And in the Balkans, though Austria-Hungary has avoided immediate war with Serbia, the underlying ethnic tensions have not disappeared. Nationalist movements, temporarily quieted by diplomatic success, could resurface at any moment. Another assassination, border incident, or political crisis could reignite conflict. Peace holds, but it remains fragile. No massive social revolutions, yet. The absence of war also alters Europe's social and political landscape. In our timeline, World War I shattered class structures, gave rise to women's suffrage movements, and inspired revolutionary change across many nations. Without the war's upheaval, these transformations happen more slowly, or perhaps differently. Women's roles in society may not expand as quickly without millions of men gone to war. Labor movements, which gained strength in the war's aftermath, might remain more fragmented, and political extremism, whether communist or fascist, lacks the fertile ground of economic collapse and post-war bitterness. Without the horror and futility of trench warfare, the cynicism and disillusionment that shaped 20th century art and literature may never fully take hold. Writers like Hemingway, Remarque, and Sassoon might have had very different careers, or perhaps never found their voice at all. Who doesn't rise to power? And what of the individuals whose destinies were forged in war? Without the defeat of Germany and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler remains a failed artist or a disillusioned nobody in Vienna, rather than a dictator commanding the world's attention. Without the chaos of wartime Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks may never topple the Tsar, leaving Russia's monarchy or reformist movements intact. Future leaders like Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin would live very different lives in this world, their defining moments delayed or denied entirely. A temporary peace or a delayed conflict. So what's the bottom line? Europe enjoys a reprieve from war in the short term, but peace remains a high-wire act. No great war devastates the continent. No trenches scar the landscape. No generation is lost in the mud of Flanders. But the causes of conflict, nationalism, imperial ambition, militarism, and unresolved rivalries still exist. Another crisis could ignite a war in the 1920s or 1930s, or perhaps, with the passing of volatile leaders and the cooling of imperial ambitions, Europe slowly transitions into a more peaceful, cooperative age. For now, though, the streets of Europe remain filled with life, rather than the marching boots of soldiers, and millions of families are spared the heartbreak of war, at least for a while. But this peaceful world raises new questions. What happens to the revolutions, dictatorships, and political movements that defined the 20th century? What becomes of Lenin, Hitler, and the forces of extremism without a global war to fuel their rise? Imagine a Europe where the very names that defined an era, Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, never rise to the heights of power. A Europe where the political earthquakes of the 20th century remain dormant because the fuse of World War I never ignites. Without the catastrophic collapse of empires, without the social and economic devastation of war, the political landscape takes an entirely different shape. Let's start in Russia. In our reality, World War I shattered the Russian Empire. The Tsar's government collapsed under the strain of a war it was ill-prepared to fight. Soldiers mutinied, workers revolted, and in the chaos of 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized their chance. The Russian Revolution changed the world, creating the first communist state and setting the stage for the Cold War. But without World War I, the Tsar's regime never faces that critical test. The economy, while backward, doesn't collapse under wartime shortages. The military, though poorly led, isn't forced into disastrous battles. Discontent simmers but does not boil over. Could the Romanovs have reformed the empire from within? Possibly. Some historians believe Tsar Nicholas II was too stubborn to embrace real reform. But his son, or a successor influenced by moderate reformers, might have modernized Russia over time, perhaps transitioning to a constitutional monarchy like Britain. Russia could have gradually industrialized, liberalized, and joined the ranks of Europe's evolving monarchies, rather than collapsing into chaos and communism. Now, let's turn to Germany. World War I's defeat humiliated Germany. The Treaty of Versailles stripped it of territory, crushed its economy with reparations, and left its people bitter and desperate. That humiliation became the fuel for Adolf Hitler's rise. He capitalized on German anger, offering scapegoats and promising restored glory. But in a world without war, there is no Versailles Treaty, no humiliating defeat, no ruined economy. Germany, already one of the most advanced industrial powers in the world, continues to grow and prosper. Political debate remains lively but less extreme. Nationalists still exist, but without the trauma of defeat, they struggle to gain mass support. In this alternate timeline, Adolf Hitler, a failed art student from Vienna, perhaps never leaves Austria. Maybe he becomes a second-rate painter or a forgotten veteran of Balkan border skirmishes, but not the dictator of the Third Reich. Germany itself remains an ambitious, proud nation. It continues to compete with Britain and France industrially and militarily, but as part of a balance of power game, rather than a battle for survival. Diplomacy, not dictatorship, shapes its future. And what about Austria-Hungary? Franz Ferdinand's survival could give the empire a second chance. His plans for federal reforms would have given autonomy to restless ethnic groups, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and others, turning the empire into a more modern, multinational federation. By addressing the grievances that fueled nationalism, he might have delayed, or even prevented, the empire's collapse. Austria-Hungary could have survived as a major Central European power, balancing Germany to the north and Russia to the east. But let's not forget about the United States. In our reality, America's involvement in World War I marked its debut as a global superpower. Before the war, the U.S. was a rising economic giant, but preferred to stay out of European conflicts. The war changed everything. By 1918, American troops were fighting in France, American loans were propping up Britain and France, and American industries were supplying the war effort. But in this alternate timeline, with no war to drag it onto the world stage, America remains more isolationist. It focuses on domestic growth, the booming industries, the rise of Hollywood, the spread of automobiles, and consumer culture. The 1920s still roar in the U.S., but without the sense of global responsibility that the war instilled. Without World War I, there is no League of Nations, no 14 points, and no Wilsonian idealism shaping global diplomacy. This delay in American global leadership could profoundly reshape the 20th century. Would the U.S. still become the arsenal of democracy later on? Would it still lead in science, technology, and culture? Probably. But the timeline is pushed back. Other powers, like Britain, France, or even Germany, might remain dominant a little longer. And what of the ideologies that shaped so much of our world? Without the devastation of total war, both communism and fascism struggled to gain traction. Communism, born from the chaos of Russia's collapse, might remain a fringe ideology, discussed by intellectuals in cafes, but never wielded by governments. Fascism, a reaction to communism and wartime humiliation, might never move beyond street gangs and fringe movements. Yes, nationalist sentiments and class struggles still exist. Europe in the early 20th century was a hotbed of social change and competing ideologies. But without the economic ruin and political vacuum left by war, these movements remain marginal. Instead, constitutional monarchies, parliamentary governments, and evolving democracies continue to dominate Europe's political landscape. But that doesn't mean peace is guaranteed forever. Ambitions remain. Old rivalries still simmer. Without a great war to exhaust and humble the great powers, it's possible that a different conflict, perhaps in the Balkans, Africa, or Asia, could ignite future wars. Or perhaps the world slips into a cold competition between empires, where power is balanced, but tensions are high. What's fascinating is the absence of the political monsters of the 20th century. No Stalin rising from a bloody revolution. No Hitler channeling national humiliation into genocidal rage. No Mussolini parading through Rome as the founder of fascism. Instead, the early 20th century might see figures like Franz Ferdinand, British Prime Minister Asquith, French President Poincaré, or even reform-minded Russians shaping a very different world order. Leaders more cautious, more diplomatic, and, dare we say it, more boring. But sometimes boring is good. Millions of lives, spared from war and genocide, would certainly think so. Still, human history rarely stands still. Even without a world war, economic competition, colonial rivalries, and nationalist movements could create future conflicts. Would the balance of power last, or would a new crisis ignite another fire? To answer that, we need to look at the broader picture. Could peace really hold forever? Or would Europe stumble into a different kind of war down the road? Even with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand avoided, and the guns of August silenced, Europe's deeper problems don't simply disappear. Nationalism, militarism, and imperial rivalries remain very much alive, just waiting for another spark to ignite them. Peace holds in 1914, but history is rarely content to sit still. If not a world war in 1914, then when? And what would it look like? Let's start with the basics. Without the trauma of World War I, military strategy evolves on a slower, different path. The great powers never experience the grinding horror of trench warfare. Generals don't learn the brutal lessons of machine guns cutting down cavalry charges, or artillery turning entire towns into rubble. Without that baptism by fire, Europe's military doctrines might remain rooted in 19th century thinking. Big armies, bold offensives, and outdated tactics. And when the next crisis does come, whether in the 1920s, 1930s, or beyond, it likely looks very different from the industrial slaughterhouse of our World War I. It might be more localized, a conflict between 2 or 3 nations rather than a global cataclysm. Perhaps a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia still happens later on. Maybe Germany and Russia clash over influence in Eastern Europe, or perhaps Britain and France confront Germany over colonial territories in Africa or Asia. The absence of World War I also means the weaponry of modern warfare advances more slowly. Tanks, chemical weapons, and automatic firearms, products of necessity in our timeline's trenches, might be delayed by decades. The technological arms race that WWI kickstarted would move at a far more leisurely pace. Radar, jet engines, and even early computers, which got a huge boost from wartime needs, might not emerge until the late 20th century. The world remains armed, yes, but far less deadly, at least for a while. The fall of empires still looms. But military technology isn't the only factor shaping conflict. Empires are still cracking under pressure. The Ottoman Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, was already falling apart before 1914. Even without the Great War accelerating its collapse, internal strife and nationalist revolts would eventually tear it apart. But without Britain and France swooping in to divide the spoils, the map of the modern Middle East might look radically different. Instead of the British carving out Iraq and Palestine, or the French claiming Syria and Lebanon, we might see more regional powers filling the vacuum. Perhaps a stronger Turkey emerges sooner, or Arab nationalist movements gain independence earlier. On their own terms, not Western ones. The absence of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and colonial meddling might spare the region from some of the artificial borders and political chaos that plague it today. Or, just as likely, new rivalries would fill the void, and the Middle East struggles would take a different form. Asia's rising storm. While Europe's powers focus on their uneasy peace, Asia's power struggles heat up. Japan, having already beaten Russia in 1905, is eager to expand its influence. In our timeline, World War I distracted the Western powers, giving Japan a free hand in East Asia. Without that distraction, Japan's expansionism might happen sooner or face stronger resistance. China, already fractured by internal revolts and warlord conflicts, could become a battleground between Japanese ambitions and European colonial interests. Perhaps Britain and France, freed from the demands of a European war, pour more resources into defending their Asian colonies and trade routes. Or perhaps they cut deals with Japan, creating new power balances in the Pacific. And let's not forget the United States. Without the distraction of a global war in Europe, America's gaze might turn westward sooner, taking a more active role in shaping the Pacific. Maybe tensions between the U.S. and Japan over territories like the Philippines and Hawaii heat up earlier, setting the stage for a different Pacific conflict long before World War II. Colonial independence. Delayed revolutions. Now, let's talk about the colonies. One of the biggest effects of World War I was the way it weakened Europe's empires and inspired colonial uprisings. Soldiers from India, Africa, and Southeast Asia fought for their colonial rulers, only to return home and demand independence. The war's chaos, combined with the economic strain on Britain and France, cracked the foundations of colonial rule. But in this alternate timeline, without the war draining their strength, the European empires remained stronger. Independence movements in India, Vietnam, and much of Africa might still emerge, but they face more formidable opposition. Britain might hold on to India longer. France could tighten its grip on Indochina. Colonial revolutions might be delayed by decades or face harsher crackdowns. At the same time, the absence of war prevents the spread of ideas like Wilsonian self-determination, which inspired many colonial leaders. without the example of war-weary Europe questioning its own values, the push for freedom may take a very different path. A different cultural world. But perhaps the biggest change is in our culture. In our timeline, the horrors of World War I birthed a deep cynicism that shaped art, literature, and philosophy for generations. The lost generation of the 1920s, writers like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Stein, channeled their disillusionment into powerful works that questioned everything about modern society. Without the trenches of the Western Front, without the trauma of shell shock and senseless slaughter, this cultural shift never happens. Maybe literature remains romantic, not existential. Maybe modernism, with its fractured narratives and skeptical tones, never fully takes hold. Art, music, and politics might remain more optimistic, less jaded. Even our politics might be less extreme. Without the fear and trauma of total war, there's less demand for radical solutions. Perhaps Europe avoids the rise of fascism and communism, remaining on a more moderate, if still imperfect, path. But what about the future? Still, history teaches us that problems delayed are not problems solved. Could Europe's uneasy peace really last forever? Or would a different conflict arise, maybe in 1925, or 1933, or 1940, driven by the same forces of nationalism, ambition, and fear? Perhaps the next war would be smaller, regional rather than global. Maybe a conflict between Germany and France over colonial trade, or a Russian civil war spilling across borders. Or maybe, without the lessons of World War I, the eventual war would be even worse, fought with outdated tactics against modern weapons, producing chaos on an unimaginable scale. Or maybe, just maybe, the absence of the Great War would buy the world enough time to reform. Diplomats could build stronger alliances, leaders might resolve disputes through treaties, and empires could transition to more peaceful federations rather than crumbling in flames. And what about technology? One final thought. Without the urgency of wartime innovation, technology advances more slowly. Radar, cryptography, rocketry, and jet engines all got their start in the labs of wartime Europe. Even something as basic as antibiotics became widespread because of war efforts. The 20th century tech boom, spanning everything from aviation to electronics, might arrive decades later. And with it, our world today could be very different. Perhaps we'd still be waiting for the first moon landing. Maybe computers wouldn't fit in our pockets yet. Or maybe, without war draining resources, peacetime innovation would eventually catch up, just on a slower timeline. So what does this mean for us? All this brings us to one final question. How does this alternate history shape the world we live in today? Would our nations, our technology, and our way of life be better off without the scars of World War I, or would new conflicts have scarred the world in different ways? So here we are, standing in the 21st century, looking back through the lens of an alternate history. A world where Franz Ferdinand never died in Sarajevo, where the guns of August never fired, and where millions of lives were never lost in two devastating world wars. But what kind of world would this be today? Would it truly be better, or simply different? Let's start with Europe, the heart of the old world. Without two world wars ripping it apart, Europe likely remains the global epicenter of power. Instead of handing the torch to the United States, European empires such as Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and even a reformed Russia might still dominate global politics and trade. Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg could rival or even overshadow New York, Washington, and Silicon Valley as global hubs of culture, finance, and diplomacy. Without the destruction of two world wars, the economic center of gravity stays firmly planted in Europe. America, without the massive boost of war-driven industry and post-war reconstruction efforts, may remain a powerful but more regional force, perhaps still focused inward on its vast continental domain rather than projecting power across the oceans. No United Nations, no NATO, no Cold War. In this alternate world, the great global institutions we take for granted might never exist. The United Nations, born from the ashes of World War II as a global forum for peace, may not materialize without the shared trauma of global conflict to inspire its creation. NATO, the Cold War alliance that united the West against Soviet communism, wouldn't form in a world where no Soviet Union rises to threaten its neighbors. The entire framework of international cooperation, imperfect though it may be, could look radically different or be missing altogether. Instead of a world shaped by the ideological struggle between democracy and communism, we might see a world of competing empires, balancing power through old-fashioned diplomacy and colonial influence. No nuclear age? And what about the bomb? Without World War II, the Manhattan Project never happens. The race to split the atom remains a scientific curiosity rather than a wartime necessity. Nuclear weapons might still be discovered eventually, science marches on. But without the urgency of total war, it's possible that the nuclear age is delayed by decades. A world without nuclear weapons might seem safer at first glance. But paradoxically, the threat of mutually assured destruction also helped prevent large-scale wars between superpowers in our timeline. Would a nuclear-free world be more peaceful? Or would it be a return to endless conventional wars between rival empires? A world still under empire. But peace comes at a cost. One of the most tragic legacies of World War I and II was also one of their unintended consequences, the collapse of colonial empires. The wars bankrupted Britain, France, and others, making it impossible to maintain their overseas empires. Independence movements in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia gained strength from the wars, and war-weary empires lacked the will and means to stop them. Without these wars weakening Europe, colonialism might endure far longer. India could still be under British rule today. Vietnam, Algeria, and sub-Saharan Africa might remain under French control. Southeast Asia could be divided between Dutch, French, and British territories. Anti-colonial leaders, like Gandhi and Ho Chi Minh, might remain voices in the wilderness, without the global sympathy and weakened colonial powers that allowed their movements to succeed. This is a world where millions of people remain under imperial rule well into the 21st century. And with that comes the suppression of human rights, the exploitation of resources, and the denial of self-determination to entire continents. Civil rights delayed. Even in the West, civil rights movements might stall. In our reality, returning war veterans, black, white, and otherwise, demanded equal rights after fighting for freedom abroad. The struggles for women's suffrage, racial equality, and labor rights all gained momentum from the war's upheaval. Without those wars, without millions of citizens demanding change, civil rights movements could be delayed by decades. Women might still be fighting for the right to vote in some nations. Racial segregation and systemic discrimination could remain entrenched longer. Economic inequality might be greater, with fewer social safety nets created in response to wartime needs. America's cultural and technological role diminished. And what about the America we know today? Without World War II, the United States might never rise as the world's cultural and technological powerhouse. Hollywood became a global phenomenon, partly because European studios and markets collapsed during the war. Silicon Valley's rise was fueled by wartime research in electronics and computing. The space race was driven by Cold War competition. Without these global struggles, America's cultural exports, its movies, music, and media, might play second fiddle to Europe's. The technological revolution could happen more slowly, perhaps centered in Berlin, London, or Vienna, rather than California. No Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. No GI Bill fueling America's post-war middle class. No moon landing as a symbol of American ingenuity. The American century might never have happened. A more peaceful world, or just a different struggle. So, does this world sound better or worse? In some ways, it seems more peaceful. Tens of millions of lives spared from the horrors of 2 world wars. Cities like Warsaw, Dresden, and Hiroshima never reduced to rubble. Generations grow up without the trauma of total war. But peace does not equal freedom. Many nations remain trapped in colonial rule. Civil rights and social progress stall. Dictatorship and autocracy, while perhaps less genocidal than fascism and communism, still hold sway in empires that rule vast populations without consent. And there's another danger. Without the harsh lessons of two world wars, humanity might never confront its own worst impulses. Without the horrors of the Holocaust, the world's understanding of genocide, human rights, and international justice might be far less developed. Perhaps the wars, terrible as they were, forced humanity to rethink its values and build a better world in their aftermath. Or maybe, in this alternate history, people find a better path without such suffering. We'll never know. So, what do you think? And now it's your turn to decide. Would this alternate world truly be a utopia, peaceful, prosperous, and stable? Or would it simply be a different kind of struggle, where empires last longer, freedoms arrive later, and conflicts simmer just beneath the surface? Maybe the lesson here is that history is never simple. Every event, no matter how tragic, shapes what comes after it in ways we can't always predict. So what do you think? Would you want to live in this alternate 21st century? A world without world wars, but also without the freedoms, innovations, and struggles that defined our modern age? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Would this world be better, or just another version of human conflict and compromise? So, what do you think? If Archduke Franz Ferdinand had lived, and the First World War never happened, would the world today be a more peaceful place? Or would human nature, with all its ambition, fear, and pride, have found another way to tear itself apart? History is full of crossroads where a single moment could have changed everything. But maybe some forces, like the struggle for power, freedom, and identity, are just too big to stop. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you see this alternate timeline playing out? Would Europe still be an empire-dominated powerhouse? Would America still rise to global leadership? Would freedom and equality have come sooner? Or much, much later? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. Do you think this world would be better? Or just different? And if you enjoyed exploring this incredible what if with us, don't forget to share this video with your friends. Let's spread the curiosity and keep asking the big questions that make us think deeper about our past and our future. Thanks so much for watching. Stay curious, stay questioning, and we'll see you next time with another mind-bending alternate history.